Why is Richard Rorty's contribution to American pragmatism so distinctive and so important? It's because of the specific conceptual framework that he offers on truth and knowledge, and that's the framework of the ironist. My first exposure to irony in literature as a child was O. Henry's short story, Gift of the Magi, in which a married couple were planning on giving each other great Christmas presents, and in order to do so, they sacrificed an item that was essential to their receiving their spouse's present. So the wife sacrificed her hair so that she could pay for her husband's fob on his watch, and the husband sacrificed his watch so he could buy her some hair combs. So my understanding of irony is the experience of a situation in which what one does results in the opposite effect to what one is expecting. The previous example reminds me of the cliche, no good deed goes unpunished. So his description of an ironist is a person who doesn't think that the worldview, their particular conceptions of value, justice, moral duties, eudaimonia, their conception of the good life, what it consists of, is only provisional, and it may be replaced by them in the future. So, although the current worldview that they espouse is based on logically supported and rationally supported premises, she knows that she had really well supported ideas about justice, moral value, etc. in the past, and they have been replaced by her current conceptual framework. She sometimes wishes that she was born into a different culture, given the value that culture provides in terms of solutions to her problems. My own personal example, with the loss of my son, I sought out the wisdom of Buddhism, which presupposes there is no real ego. It's an illusion. And the cause of all human suffering is attachment. Believe it or not, that helped me a lot while I was going through the grieving process. Rorty agrees with Cornel West's and Dewey's philosophies of flux and change. And these pragmatists reject a view that he calls a metaphysical approach to the important issues of meaning and truth, social policy making. For metaphysicians, rather than ironists, they require a conceptual framework of essences, the significant, unchanging, essential qualities of an object, a person, a community, natural objects, and these essences define reality or correspond to reality. For example, Plato's ideas or forms of the essences of beauty, truth, goodness, justice, etc., all take on the idea that these are the essences of beautiful objects, truthful persons, etc. And that in order to achieve this knowledge of their ideal essence, the essence of beauty, you need to abstract from the particular concrete details of your life, beautiful persons, beautiful art objects, since the beauty of a person may fade and the justice of a social policy decision may turn out to have more problems than it solves. This is because from Plato's view, they are only approximations, changing applications of these essences. For example, Plato's conception of the soul as having three parts, reason, passion, and instincts, provides an explanation in his day and time of irrational behavior. So his notion of the soul is of a three-part being which experiences reincarnation depending its form depending on how virtuous these individuals were in their current life. So the stain of one's immoral deeds remains in the soul in the process of transmigration into a different body. So Plato's theory of the soul, the immortal soul, the tripartite soul, provides an interesting explanation of certain facts that we're aware of. A person's inherited temperaments, they're based on their previous incarnation in a different body. Deja vu, we recognize things as familiar because in our past life we experience them. And also what happens to us after death. It worked at the time to solve the problems of the time, but modern psychology has substituted the notion of psyche for the soul in order to understand personal character, personal temperaments, irrational behavior, for example, by appealing to the unconscious. So modern psychologists, including Freud, aren't interested in constructing scenarios of life after death, but are concerned with the scenarios of a person's infancy, infant's life after birth, so to speak. And recognizing these early childhood experiences are essential to our rational behavior as an adult. So Rorty's argument is that the nature of language and our own individual worldviews are metaphorical, not just obviously metaphorical ideas that don't have an obvious, precise, literal meaning, such as the elephant in the room or referring to a human situation as the perfect storm. But he would argue that metaphors characterize all of our concepts of dignity, what it means to be a person, the subject-object relationship in our sentences. These are all metaphorical concepts. Nietzsche held a similar belief about all language being metaphorical. Our notions of ourselves as unified subjects, our notions of ourselves as doer of deeds. One reason why Nietzsche believes that the concept of the doer of deeds is metaphorical because of its connection with the subject-object distinction in many languages' syntax. And Nietzsche claimed there is no doer, there are just deeds. Royce's argument that our deeds are examples, paradigmatic instances of the absolute, given they're irrevocable. So Rorty views the use of language as metaphorical as analogous to the obvious metaphorical language of our scientific theories. Quantum physics replacement of the science of mechanics and the metaphors of neurons, protons, electrons, quanta are re-descriptions which provide explanations that previous theories, physical theories, scientific theories, couldn't explain. The anomalies that previous scientific paradigms couldn't explain. For example, the scientific theories regarding light as particles was replaced by one which understood light as waves, and that in turn was replaced by a paradigm which viewed light as either particles or waves depending on the context. So Rorty views each of the successive philosophical theories that constitute the history of philosophy, in particular regarding truth, examples, realism, idealism, intersubjectivity as a basis of knowledge, Cartesian dualism, Kant's categorical imperatives, and his a priori categories of causation, space, and time, these have been replaced by more successful responses to the key philosophical questions of the particular epoch they lived in. So, for example, the Enlightenment ideas of reason, freedom, what it means to be a person, justice, were an attempt at the time, given the historic French and British revolutions, given at the time to replace a religious worldview and religious leaders as authorities on knowledge with secular worldviews and ideas of reason, freedom, and rights. Consider this: the concept of basic human rights did not exist in Greek philosophy. Those ancient Greek philosophers experienced a culture in which the city-state, the polis, was dominated by the state's policies. And the obligations of residents or citizens were based on the health of the state as a whole. And the state's responsibilities to the citizens were also based on supporting the ideal polity with their reigning notions of justice. They didn't have an analogous concept of basic human rights. There were duties, but not entitlements. So each of these theories, for example, basic human rights, have replaced previous ones on the basis of how well they solved the problems of the day. The idea of universal basic human rights really didn't come into our secular vocabularies, secular political vocabularies, until the UN Declaration of Basic Human Rights in 1948, itself a response to the tragic state of refugees as a result of the two world wars. Another good example, our current conception of autonomy as the capacity of a person to critically evaluate their motivations and see whether they still want to be motivated by them has replaced earlier conceptions of autonomy. For example, the one proposed by Kant as a self-legislating person, a person that gives himself his own motivations. So the ideas, for example, of free will and determinism, the metaphors of free will and determinism have been replaced by conceptions of authenticity and autonomy. And the metaphors of free will and determinism resemble the metaphors from the science of mechanics. But neither free will nor determinism can offer concrete ideas of how our lives can be made better with respect to critically evaluating our motivations. For example, consider John Dewey's understanding of our addictions. It doesn't require a solution to the free will determinism debate. It requires a consideration of how our habits, are adaptations to our environment and how they function in terms of these adaptations. So, for example, our addictions can't be eliminated just by beefing up our willpower. It requires a careful analysis and changes made to our current habits. Philosophers have recognized that replacing one idiom, or in Wittgenstein's terms, one language game, depends on which language game is more successful in terms of solving real problems, or when an individual does so with regard to his own conception of eudaimonia, his own conception of the good life. For example, I needed to give up my dream of becoming a classical pianist performing at Carnegie Hall when I realized the futility of that dream. And so my notion of the good life has been substituted to include the idea of being a good pianist rather than a world-renowned pianist. So the ironist believes that a solution to a specific set of problems depends on how successful that solution is, rather than looking at that solution as getting us closer to reality, as getting us closer to understanding basic essences. So, for example, Cornel West's own unique version of pragmatism as a prophetic Chekhovian version of pragmatism was based on this form of pragmatism offering better solutions to the concrete problems, the concrete difficult moral, social, and political problems and crises which are occurring in contemporary life. For Cornel West, this requires narratives of heroic figures such as the ones in the Bible, or in Judaism. And these narratives are of heroic figures with distinctive moral visions, unlike the superheroes that populate our contemporary media. Many 19th and 20th century philosophers have taken the view that language is contingent. If we were born into a very different culture with a very different type of language in terms of its ruling metaphors, we would have a very different perspective on the world and our own identities, because our identities are predicated on the language with which we construct them, and these are contingent. Nietzsche's understanding of the worldview of Europeans in mid-19th century is based on his own discussion of the respective wills to power in those centuries. So, for example, Christianity's model, as understood in European cultures at the time, of a good person, someone who's humble, compassionate, altruistic, forgiving, merciful, meek, all of these sustain the lower classes in Europe in states of oppression and domination. Wittgenstein, in turn, viewed different conceptual frameworks as example of different language games: math, molecular theory, idealism, liberal rights, and they're understood and defended not based on how well they mirror reality, but on how well they serve human purposes. His idea, the limits of our language are the limits of our world. There's a story about an indigenous culture which had 20 words for snow. And you can imagine they came up with those 20 ideas based on their own relationships with snow and the beauty or problems they created for their environment. Rorty argues that all successive conceptual frameworks, whether in the history of philosophy or on the part of an ironist, are metaphorical forms of redescription. But the ironist finds herself in a paradoxical position. At the time she defends and operates on a specific worldview, she believes that that worldview is rationally and logically supported at that time. But there aren't shared criteria by which to judge whether whose theory is more correct in its role of redescription. So her successive redescriptions may not share such criteria of truth. For example, as the metaphysician's criteria, unchanging essences which correspond to reality. We can see that correspondence when it's applied to a relationship between our mental representations and the world out there is a metaphor. compared with a relativist who may argue that truth and knowledge has to be approached in the context of the culture in which it's embedded. So, although Richard Rorty might be described as a cultural relativist, he's not a moral relativist. He doesn't believe that practices like torture, genital mutilation, cannibalism can be ethically justified just because of their role in the cultures from which they emanate. And in contrast, the metaphysical approach views the creation of new concepts and new theories for dealing with reality as a process of discovery, what's real, and that in turn requires discovering the essences, while the ironist and generally postmodern philosophers view this type of process as of using new concepts as a process of creation. Rorty's example. Freud created new metaphors, the Oedipus complex, the Electra complex, the castration complex, penis envy, sublimation, substitution. Freud created these concepts in order to explain why we as rational beings do things that are irrational. That is based on the events that occurred in our childhood, the situations we dealt with as infants or toddlers. And he explains why we have or have not developed consciences is based on how we accepted the role of our father's authority and essentially the superego as the basis for social authority in their culture. So Rorty uses Freud's metaphors, including the ones referring to infancy and childhood situations, as forms of redescribing the identity of each individual, which is constructed on a foundation of these events, blind impressions. And psychotherapy provides an opportunity for a person to construct their identity based on recognizing, discovering what has happened in the past through psychotherapy, and then redescribing it in one's own terms. So Rorty argues that any description we use to refer to our actions and our situations from our past is based on our application of our own unique set of metaphors. This would explain why, for example, two siblings may have such different recollections of what happened in their past. One sibling may recall their sibling doing actions which she regards as sadistic, and that sibling may regard what he did as funny, empowering instances. By creating our own narratives of what happened to us in our childhood, Rorty uses a Nietzschean idea, thus I willed it. Now, thus I willed it seems like a good explanation of or interpretation of Nietzsche's own idea of eternal recurrence. What happens in the past is doomed to be repeated ad infinitum. Some philosophers interpret that from the viewpoint of whether an individual could will to have his or her particular action in the present repeated ad infinitum into the future and by other individuals. So in Nietzsche's conception of the self as an object of recreation, it would include how we picture our own narrative in light of how we want our future to go. And for Nietzsche, that meant our capacity for our will to power or not to be dominated by others. So, for example, a person that has experienced traumatic events in the past can be enabled to rise above them by redescribing those views, possibly with the help of a therapist. Yet others that don't do that kind of work can be left in a permanent state of post-traumatic stress disorder. In conclusion, I want to say that Rorty's distinctive view of pragmatism is inspired by his view of the ironic person And it's a separate factual issue of whether a society full of ironists can maintain the social glue of their society based on a common core of values.